Charles and his Austrasian forces had tasted victory at Amblève, and he'd promised everyone who followed him that to do so would bring them honor, glory, and most importantly, plunder. How to do this was not in doubt. There were more than enough groups in the area to choose to war against, and almost all of them had done something to bring the ire of Charles and the Austrasians upon them. The order in which to attack was the real question, and to make that decision, Charles called all of his lieutenants to a war council. The debate about who to first attack eventually devolved into a single point of contention. Should the Austrasians first attack outside of Francia, or should they turn their forces west and complete the subjugation of the Neustrians that had been started in Amblève? Almost to a man, the group preferred the notion of striking out and expanding their territory against non-Franks. Yet everyone also realized that doing so would expose their western flank for the Neustrians to take advantage. Ragenfrid and his group had been stung, but they would regroup. They had wealth and resources with which to recruit forces. And more importantly than that, they had a banner to rally behind. They had the king, and it was around this that the conversation turned. How could the Austrasians get their hands on Chilperic II? This sticking point led to frustration, and soon enough, the men in the room began to bicker and shout. All except one. Charles, seated at the head of the table, noticed this single advisor. He was an island of quiet and thought in a room otherwise filled with warlike men with too much testosterone and not enough intelligence. Tired of hearing the shouting and repetitive arguments, Charles finally called for silence and directed everyone to return to their seats. He looked at his quiet advisor and asked him to share his thoughts. The man, initially surprised to be put on the spot, spoke nervously at first, but then gained confidence as the words flowed forth in the now quiet room. He said, "My lord, I've sat here and listened to the ideas everyone has put forward. To kidnap the king, to murder him, to somehow draw him out from behind his lines. While all of these ideas make sense, they're all a bit obvious. Ragenfrid will be expecting any and all of them, and will make sure the king is protected, even if that means stashing him in a closet against his will." At this mental image, several of the men began to chuckle, and several others began to argue anew. Charles again commanded them to be quiet, and his advisor went on with his thought. "There is something I don't understand. Why is it exactly that we remain enthralled to a king attempting to rule us from Neustria? What right does he have to claim dominion over us, especially when we have so recently shown him and his court that he has no ability to do so by force of arms? Even more than this, how do we know that he even is the king? From what I remember of the last king, Ragenfrid rode out to a monastery one day, came home, and when he got back, the king was mysteriously dead. And Ragenfrid just so happened to have met a monk that very day who turned out to be the son of the late Childeric II. He had been living in a church for 40 years and simply decided not to tell anyone about his bloodline. Anyway, my lords, from what I can tell, we are sitting about, yelling at one another about how best to kill a king, when in reality, it would be much more simple to just deny that he is a king. If Ragenfrid can scrounge up somebody at random, throw some clothes and a crown on them and declare them a king of the blood, what's to stop us from doing the same? We can find some orphan child and tell the world he's Clothar IV. Didn't you know that Dagobert III had a son?" The table went eerily quiet on hearing this thought. These men of action were accustomed to having to do something to get a result. It had never crossed their mind to simply deny there was a problem in the first place. After a few moments, Charles broke the silence. "This is a dangerous game you're suggesting I play. Are you aware that not long ago my great-uncle attempted to do the same thing you're suggesting now? He tried to put his son on the throne in place of a true Merovingian, and are you aware of the result of his actions? Do you see my father or my cousin upon the throne? No, you don't, because my great-uncle and my cousin were both killed for what they did." The advisor shook his head in agreement at this. He began to speak again, knowing that his next words needed to be well chosen. "My lord, you're correct, absolutely. However, if I may, this situation is quite different than what happened with your great-uncle. Grimwald was his name, right? And his son was Childebert? Anyway, Grimwald attempted to take the throne when another king was available, Dagobert II. His attempt was an attempt at usurpation, whereas what I am suggesting is exactly the opposite. This is a chance to take the throne back for the proper kings and to relieve Chilperic, a fraud and a pretender, of the crown. You would be trying to set things to rights. You would be trying to save the monarchy by placing a rightful heir upon the throne. You would be a protector, which would make Ragnfrid a usurper. By taking away his most powerful tool to draw an army, we can get rid of him and put our own man, the right man, on the throne. Again, the room was quiet, and again, everyone seemed to be waiting on Charles's response before daring to take a breath. He stared at his advisor over the tops of his tinted fingertips. Finally, he spoke, his response breaking the building tension. Do you have any idea of where to find our quote-unquote king, this child of Dagobert III? My lord, I'm sure I'll have no issue at all finding the proper heir to the throne, given a day or two to search for him. Good, Charles responded. Bring him to me when you find him, so I can explain the nature of our situation and reiterate to him his role in it. There's nothing I hate worse than an indiscreet king. At this, the table laughed, the tension and frustration of the morning's meeting now lifting. Charles gave his orders. Leave here and draw together the army. In 3 days' time, we will assemble and begin our march, along with our new king. We leave for Neustria to shore up our flank, and to make sure every Frank understands, once and for all, that the true power of Francia belongs to the Austrasians. Once we've done that, we'll turn our sights on the Frisians. I'm tired of looking at them on our border. The men went out and did as they were told. In just a few days, they would set out to bring all of Francia under their control. They could do anything, because their leader, Charles Martel, could do anything. He could make kings. This is Thugs and Miracles. Season 2, Episode 18, Kingmaker. All right, welcome back. As always, I'm Benjamin Bernier, and this week we're going to return our sights to the Merovingian kings. They've been so quiet in this time period and overshadowed by such larger-than-life personalities that it's easy to look past them, but they deserve a glance. One thing we hit on pretty hard in the opener is the idea of legitimacy and pretenders to the crown. So let's start off today by taking a look at the history of paternity in the Merovingian Dynasty before getting back to our particular timeline in 716. Okay, where to begin? How about with our favorite queen, Fredegunda? If you remember her storyline, it was way back in 584 that her husband, King Chilperic I, was assassinated. The rumors behind this murder were of Fredegunda as the lead plotter because, according to these claims, she'd been found out in her adultery with one of the king's servants, Landry. Now, whether or not this story is true, she was forced to attest to the paternity of her son before a tribunal. From Edward James, quote, Fredegund had announced that she was pregnant again very shortly after Chilperic's death, which caused Guntram and Gregory of Tours to wonder whether Clothar was indeed Chilperic's son. Later, Guntram forced Fredegund to assemble 3 bishops and 300 leading Franks to swear that Clothar was indeed Chilperic's heir. End quote. Given that A, there was no scientific way to prove Fredegunda's claims, and B, we were less than halfway through the Merovingian dynasty, it's entirely possible, based on this story alone, that over half of the Merovingians were not Merovingian. Seriously, Clothar II was the only surviving son after all of the shenanigans that took place between Fredegunda and Brunhilde. He serves as a dynastic choke point insofar as everyone in the family tree after his reign has to draw their line back through him. If he were the son of Landry and not Chilperic I, well, that means the quote-unquote royal blood of these earliest French kings was actually the genetics of an upstart peasant girl and a non-royal advisor to the king. Moving past Fredegunda and Clothar II, We next see a fabricated king when we get to the story of Childebert III, or the Adopted, and the entire coup d'etat series with him and Grimwald. Childebert had no kids, so he doesn't affect the genetics of the Merovingian line. He simply serves as an example of how kings could be made and unmade. Along this same line, we next get to Dagobert II. He suffers from the same problem, paternity-wise, that Chilperic II suffers from in today's opener. Both of these men were longtime monks who were discovered by mayors who just so happened to need a good patsy. They weren't forced to prove their lineage, and even if they had been, how could they have shown definitive proof? In both cases, it's equally plausible to us, and in fact more so, that these men were long-suffering monks who, when given the opportunity to leave a lifestyle of prayer, devotion, discipline, and celibacy, in exchange for the chance to be treated literally like a king, jumped on the opportunity without so much as a second thought. Dagobert II would ultimately fail to produce any children who succeeded him as king, but Chilperic II would have a son who would go on to wear the crown. This leaves our discussion now with the child kings who were promoted by various mayors as being the lost children of former kings. These include Clovis III, the child put forth by Eberwin in opposition to Theoderic III, and Clothar IV, the child put forth by Charles Martel in opposition to Chilperic II, as noted in the opener. All of these cases, whether they be potentially illegitimate children, monks, or found progeny, means that by this point in the history, the quote-unquote Merovingians had quite possibly failed to be the proper Merovingians for well over a century. Even if they were still the proper genetic stock by the start of the 8th century, at this point in 716, we're seeing a monk with a 40-year-old claim of being a forgotten prince going against a discovered love child of a dead king, as if children were conceived and born with no one in the entire royal court taking notice. Here's another thing we noticed in the research. In the entire first half of the Merovingian Dynasty, there was only the one possible question of paternity, that of Clothar II, noted. In the second half of the dynasty, however, questionable claims to the throne come up with increasing frequency. We count at least 5, all of which are instigated not by the royal claimant, but by the mayor of the palace. Long story short, at this point, it is entirely possible, and probably likely, that the Merovingians were nothing more than an idea, a security blanket, so to speak, that people like to cling to. Their actual legitimacy mattered less than their perceived legitimacy, and over time, this was waning more and more. The year 656, when Grimwald attempted his coup, was too early on in this process of erosion to eliminate the Merovingians and begin a new line, but it most certainly shows that the recognition of erosion was seen by those who would like to have their chance to wear their crown. Now, in 716, 60 years later, that process of erosion was in full effect. It would be only a matter of time until it completed its cycle. With all of this discussion of the king's ineffectiveness and general irrelevance as anything other than a symbol now complete, we can turn our attention back to the true power players of 716. Let's review who they are. We have Charles at the head of the Austrasians, Ragenfrid at the head of the Neustrians, and Redbad as the king of the Frisians. Redbad and Ragenfrid had formed an alliance, but that appears to have mostly dried up once Charles and his forces were pushed out of Cologne. Outside of these three, we also have Odo, Duke of Aquitaine. He's important due to the hold he has on the south of Francia, and because he declared independence from the whole lot right around the time Pepin de Herstal died. Finally, there's Willibrord, the papal-appointed bishop of the Frisians. He'd been working in that country for over 20 years and had had a tiny amount of success. He becomes important because Redbad, pagan and hater of all things Christian, sacked and burned many of the buildings Willibrord and his adherents had worked so diligently to construct. This left Willibrord with no choice but to turn to a powerful figure for help. He'd worked quite a bit with Plectrude, but, as we said last episode, her days of power were over at the same time Ragenfrid overthrew her and her grandson. Luckily, however, there was still Charles. He was Christian, he had an army, and he was at odds with both Ragenfrid and Redbad. These three factors almost certainly drove Willibrord straight into Charles's arms, along with a large body of followers willing to fight and die for God. Charles, never one to look a gift horse in the mouth, took this endorsement and even solidified the deal by allowing Willibrord to baptize his son on Easter Day, 716. Willibrord, later in life taking on the name Boniface, would later write of his alliance with Charles, quote, "Without the aid of the Prince of the Franks, I should not be able to rule my church, nor defend the lives of my priests and nuns, nor keep my converts from lapsing into pagan rites and observances." End quote. By early 717, with his army rested and rearmed, Charles turned his sights on Neustria. He had had time to choose where he wanted to meet his enemies, and also to create an effective battle plan. And when the two sides finally fought on 21 March 717, the outcome was never really in doubt. There are not many details on how exactly the battle unfolded, but it ended, as did the Battle of Amblève, with King Chilperic II and Raginfrid riding for their lives to the gates of Paris. It was after this second battle that Charles finally introduced the world to the new king, Clothar IV. Charles was now seen as an incredibly effective military commander, with success breeding success. He had the support of the Catholic Church, a powerful force multiplier, and now, by producing his own Merovingian king, he introduced a factor into play that allowed any aristocrats still sitting on the fence due to their loyalty to the crown to come and support him without having to forego their alliance to the monarchy. Add to all of this that Charles rode back to Cologne following his victory in Vichy and took the city back from Plectrude and Theodowald without killing them, and we now have a picture of Charles Martel as a really very dynamic leader who seemed to be well aware of the use of multiple levers of power outside of just military force. Killing Plectrude and Theodowald could have evoked hurt feelings from anyone still loyal to the pair, or who at least would have blanched at the idea of killing an unarmed older woman and her grandson. But let's face it, most of the people we've discussed up until this point in our history would have done exactly that. The only question about their deaths would have been how publicly to execute them and how violently to do it. Keeping them alive cost Charles nothing and avoided any kind of blowback that may have come from their demise. All of this led to the final event, the Battle of Soissons. If this name sounds familiar, that's because way back in Season 1, we had a Battle of Soissons between Clovis and Syagrius, the last Roman ruler in Gaul. That battle ended with Syagrius routed and running for his life to the south. Want to guess how this second Battle of Soissons turned out? That's right. Much like Clovis, Charles Martel would rule the day. The victory would place him in firm control of Francia, and the losers would all be hightailing it for the south. There was a difference of 232 years between the battles, but in many ways, the results were shockingly similar. Here's how Fredegar, a contemporary, described the whole scene. Quote, "Chilperic and Raginfrid sent messengers to Duke Odo asking him for help, offering the title of king and gifts. Odo, having raised an army of Gascons, came to them, and they marched together against Charles. But Charles, firm and intrepid, promptly advanced himself to meet them. Frightened because he could not resist him, Odo fled. Charles pursued him to Paris, over the Seine, and advanced on Orléans. Having suffered great pains to escape, Odo came to the borders of his country, bringing with him King Chilperic and treasures. King Clothar died that year. The following year, Charles concluded through his envoys an alliance with Odo, who gave to him Chilperic and a lot of treasure. Coming to Noyon, Chilperic ended the course of his life and that of his reign, which had lasted 6 years. At his death, they put on the throne Theoderic, who occupies it now. This done, Prince Charles pursued Raginfrid and laid siege to Angers, and having ravaged the country, returned with a large load of plunder." End quote. I'll tell you what, Fredegar wraps up everything with a bow and a nice little paragraph. When the civil wars finally wrapped up, Charles, who not so long ago was a prisoner of his stepmother, had rung up 3 consecutive victories against the standing powers of Francia, with the third one sounding more like a Benny Hill skit than a battle, what with Odo turning tail and running at the sight of Charles and his army. Pride aside, this was probably a good choice on Odo's part. He lived to see another day and was recognized by Charles as the Duke of Aquitaine for just a bit of treasure and the transfer of control of the king. It also would work out well in the end for Charles, as Odo and Aquitaine would serve as a buffer between Austrasia and the Umayyad Caliphate when Muslim armies began to come north into Francia. Raginfrid, much like Plectrude in the last episode, is now set aside as a power player. Charles chooses not to kill him, instead taking a ransom. One has to wonder if this was expediency on Charles' part, as killing Raginfrid would have cost time, effort, and treasure through a prolonged siege of Angers, not to mention angering the people of the city and the region. Charles likely made the calculation that Raginfrid, now a 3-time loser in battle against Charles, was unlikely to bother him again, and even if he did, would be handled easily enough. So now we turn our attention back to the big losers in this whole situation, and, ironically enough, we're back to where we started, with the kings. We'll start with Chilperic II because, honestly, this guy had to have been completely thrown through a loop by everything that had happened to him in the past 6 years. First off, he'd basically won the lottery when Ragnfrid stumbled into his monastery and either recognized him as the long-lost prince of the Franks or, as we find to be more likely, chose him from amongst the other monks to play the role of the long-lost prince. He then followed Ragnfrid to victories against both Plectrude and Charles. He ransacked Cologne and had to have felt at that point like nothing on earth was going to be able to stop his lucky streak. Then came the ambush at Amblève, followed by the straight-up loss at Vichy, both events requiring him to, as Monty Python would say, run away. And then the final loss at Soissons, hammering the nail into his coffin. From that point on, Chilperic went from having a lucky streak to being the bargaining chip. Still, he was doing better than Clothar IV, who basically died the moment his character got on the stage, and all without getting to say so much as a line. However, even that bit of fortune would run out by 721, and Chilperic would end the course of his life and that of his reign without making any other contribution to history. Now, in both the case of Clothar IV and Chilperic II, we wouldn't go so far as to say they were murdered, as no contemporary source even brings this up as a possibility, but we will say that their deaths are oddly convenient for Charles. We can assume that everyone in Francia would have seen Clothar for what he was, a puppet in service to the mayor, and Chilperic would have been used to working under different management. In both cases, it's possible Charles wouldn't have wanted to have dealt with the drama. Getting a new king, and a young one at that, would have been much easier for him. Of course, it's also possible that both of these kings did simply die. It was the 8th century after all. Any which way it happened, this opened the door for the penultimate Merovingian king to take the throne, King Theoderic IV. And just for one last bit of Merovingian paternity head-scratching, well, how about this? Theoderic IV took the throne when he was 9 years old. He was born in 712 as the son of Dagobert III, who himself was only about 12 when his son was born. Now, I'm not going to say that an 11-year-old couldn't have performed the actions necessary to sire a child, but that's a really young age to have been making babies. What are the odds that someone may have given him a bit of a head start with Theoderic's unknown mother, or that, like Clothar IV or Clovis III, the child selected to sit on the throne was found, quote-unquote, amongst the populace? Honestly, by the second half of the Merovingian Dynasty, it seems like it was easier and more likely to ascend to the throne by living in an orphanage or a monastery, rather than truly being the son of a king. Alright, that's it for this week. Charles has consolidated power in Francia and can finally start looking over his borders instead of fighting with the people inside of them. The Frisians and the Saxons may want to start investing in some castles and siege supplies any time now. However, next week is going to take us down a slightly different path. You see, this whole time that the Franks have been fighting with one another, another group has been approaching from the south and taking advantage of similar infighting taking place with the Visigoths. That's right, folks. Next week, we're going to take a look at the Umayyad Caliphate and the events that would bring an army out of the Middle East, across North Africa, over the Straits of Gibraltar, onto the Iberian Peninsula, and ultimately into Francia. Okay, before we go, as always, the music used for the show comes from Josh Woodward and includes his songs Bully and Lafayette. For a free download of these songs or hundreds of other great tracks, check out his site at joshwoodward.com. Notes on this episode, an updated monarchy tree, our Instagram feed, and a list of other great history podcasts are all available online at thugsandmiracles.com. Please visit the site. We've given it a ton of updates, and sign up for the mailing list so we can keep you up to date with announcements on new shows and our monthly newsletter. Speaking of email, you can write to us at thugsandmiracles@gmail.com. You can hit us on Twitter at thugsandmiracle with no S on the end, or you can leave a comment on Facebook and Instagram at Thugs and Miracles. And don't forget the new YouTube channel. Search for Thugs and Miracles using the YouTube search bar, or click the link in the show notes. Finally, as we do every week, if you want to support us, then please do so with a 5-star rating and review on your podcatcher of choice. We appreciate you taking the time to let the world know that you enjoy the show, and for that, we appreciate you. Okay, once again, my name is Benjamin Bernier. We look forward to talking to you again next week as we take a look at the biggest challenge to come at the Franks yet in the next episode of Thugs and Miracles.